Events and also states for the sign-in form block are in place after the previous part. It's time to finally write some logic in the application layer that will be responsible for gluing the user interface presentation layer together with the other layers of the app. Hello, welcome to ResoCoder, where you are getting prepared for real app development so that you will get freelance clients or a job and be confident about the apps you've built. So subscribe and hit the bell to join us on our quest for becoming in-demand Flutter developers. As I said in the beginning, we have events. These will be coming into the block from the presentation layer where we are going to send them from. And then we have states, or actually just one state class, which we are going to update and output from the block so that we can sort of modify what's going on in the user interface. For example, we'll be able to show a progress indicator whenever is submitting is true, and so on. So let's get right to business by writing some application logic inside the sign-in form block, and we are going to utilize the authentication facade interface to really be able to write some application logic, even though this facade is currently not implemented at all. All it is just an interface, which is actually an abstract class in Dart, but it doesn't have any implementation currently in the infrastructure layer. It's just a contract which will be fulfilled by the implementation, and we can rely on the contract being true so that when we, for example, call register with email and password, we know that it's actually going to register a user and not do some crazy other thing. Blocks are focused on transforming incoming events into states. So this means that the logic inside this sign-in form block will actually be very simple. It will not do anything crazy because its sole purpose is to transform incoming events, for example, this email change event containing a string, into a state which will have an updated email address. That's it. The validation of the email address, which is a logic in itself, will not happen inside the block. The block doesn't care about validation. That validation happens inside the value object, validate email address. So really, you will see throughout this course that we are going to sort of layer logic on top of one another. And this means that none of the logic or none of the classes which hold logic will be complex in themselves. Yes, the logic will be fairly complex when you put it together, but the individual classes will be very easy to understand because you will not have one God object, as they are called, which does everything possible throughout the app. No, you will have just really focused objects following the single responsibility principle, and you are gonna be good to go with understanding what's going on in the individual objects. And also be sure to check out the written tutorial from the link in the description, where you can find all of the code written in this video and overall go through this lesson at your own pace, whether that be that you wanna follow along more quickly or even slowly. The mapping of events to state will of course happen inside the map event to state method. And again, if you don't know that much about Bloc yet, I really recommend you to check out a separate tutorial from the card in the corner. And since the events which we have created in the previous part are a union, we can utilize some very nice features of the Dart language to really enforce that all of the events are handled, and we will not need to remember which one we already handled or not. So it's going to be very easy. All we need to do here is to yield each with the asterisk, and we want to yield each possible sign-in form state, which will be emitted from events.map and we want to map every single possible event here. This is what I was talking about. We cannot possibly forget to handle a single event because it would not compile. And after we select all the nulls with Control D or Command D in VS Code, all right, we've just selected everything probably. Now we want to use my snippet block event handler. Now add a comma at the end, and boom, we got all of this, and it didn't even hurt to write this code because it was written basically automatically. And also you can get this code right from the written tutorial so that you do not need to type it out yourself. So let's first handle the email changed and the password changed events. They're gonna be pretty simple to deal with because we just need to update the state with the validated email address, because this event which comes in contains an email string. But we don't want to have strings in the state, we want to have the email address value object. So let's yield a new state, or rather a copied state. So for example, if this event arrives in as the first one, the state will be still just initial, which means that the email address will contain an empty string, which will make it invalid. And then when the user types in a new character to the email address, we are going to validate the newly updated email address string. So we want to just copy the already existing state with some newly changed values. And those are going to be email address, which will be just the email address value object. And it will contain the e.email string. So far so good, but what may not be so obvious that we need to do right over here is to set the auth failure or success option to none. If you remember from the previous part, this auth failure or success option holds the response from the previous call to sign in or register. So for example, if the response is that we have registered successfully, it's going to hold some unit. If there was some problem during the registration, for example, there was some server failure, it will hold none left, some kind of an auth failure. The thing is that this auth failure or success option can over time hold also the sort of old responses. So let's imagine that the user types in an email address, reso@resocoder.com, for example, I don't know, this address actually doesn't exist. And the user then tries to sign in with this email address, but the server returns some sort of an error. So the user could not sign in, the sign-in didn't go through. So the user is still stuck at the sign-in screen, at the sign-in form. But what if he decides to then change the email address to say matt@resocoder.com? Is it correct to associate even this new email address, which was changed by the user, with the previous error coming from the server? Well, of course, it's not correct. And that's why whenever the email address is updated, we also need to sort of reset the response from the server to be none, which basically means null or safe null. You can think of it as that. All right, so this is what we do for when the email changes. We can now just copy this and paste it into password changed. It's going to be very similar, but of course, instead of modifying the email address field on the state, we are instead going to modify the passwords. So passwords and pass in email string. Whoa, there is some sort of an error, of course. So let's go back to the sign-in form event. And I apologize, but in the previous part, I made a blunder. This, of course, should be named password string or something like that. All right, and now when we run the code generation, it's all going to be fixed again. Awesome, coming back to the block file, we can now change this to password string. And now we can go ahead and implement sign in with Google pressed. while these email changed and password changed events practically delegated all of the logic to the validation which happens inside the value objects, this sign in with Google pressed event will actually perform some logic itself. What we need to do is to first indicate that the form is being submitted, and then we're going to use the IAuth facade, which we have an instance right over here, to actually call the method sign in with Google. So let's first go ahead and indicate by yielding state.copyWith that we are signing in, so is submitting will be true. And then also let's just again reset auth failure or success option, because we are again signing in again and the possible previous response from the server no longer applies, so we want to reset it. Then immediately we want to get the sign in with Google server response, so we're going to say await auth facade dot sign in with Google, and this grants us either a failure or unit, which means success. So we're gonna put this inside final failure or success. And with this done, we can now again yield another state. Let's just copy it from above. And over here, submitting will be false. And what's important, this auth failure or success option, which holds the response from the server, will now actually hold some sort of a value. So it will be some, and it will contain the failure or success either, which is returned from the IAuth facade. So this means we have the sign in with Google implemented. This is the more easy one of the sign in methods because we don't actually need to do many things ourselves. For example, we do not need to worry about email being valid or not valid. Things are different when it comes to signing in or registering with email and password. So what do we need to do here? Well, we need to check if the entered email address and password are valid. Then, if they are valid, we're gonna register using the IAuth facade and yield using the auth failure or success option that everything went successfully. And if email address and password are invalid, then we need to start indicating to show error messages in the UI and keep the server response to be none. Because of course, we are now going to even send along invalid email address to the server. If the email address is invalid and we know it from the client side, we're not gonna perform any requests. So let's see how this can be actually implemented. We're first going to tackle the register event handler. First up, we need to check if email is valid, and we can get the current email, which is inputted from the state of the block. State is just getting the current state, and we can then go to email address and check if it is valid. So how can we go about checking if email address is valid? Well, we could do something like value is right, and if something is right, this means that the value contains a valid string, but this is quite long-winded, so why don't we instead utilize the fact that we are using a superclass called validated value object, or actually just value object right here, and let's add a simplification, a helper method, so to say, to this value object superclass, which is going to deal with whether or not it is valid. So we're gonna add here bool is valid and just return value that is right. So we have just hidden complexity of the either type behind our nice is valid method. And I know we could make this into a getter, but I think that isValid is good to have as a method and not as a getter. That's because isWrite is also a method and not a getter. So with this done, we can now go ahead and go into our block code, and instead of checking value isWrite, we can just say isValid, and it's immediately much more expressive. But additionally, we also want to check if the password is valid. So we also need to do something like and is like state.password is valid, but this is getting quite long, this if check. So instead what we can do is to break out these two calls to separate things here. I'm just actually gonna copy it from the written tutorial, and I encourage you to do the same thing with these kinds of repetitive things. So we have just broken out is email valid and is password valid into their own separate final variables. And now we can just check is email valid and is password valid. And here we go. All right, so as soon as these two inputted fields are actually valid, we immediately want to start showing the is submitting progress indicator, because we are in the process of signing in, right? So we are going to again yield is submitting true, and again reset auth failure or success option to none for the reasons which I have outlined like at least 3 times already. And now we're going to register the user using IAuth facade. So again, final failure or success, and we're going to say await auth facade dot register with email and password, and we now need to just pass in the email address and also password. So we're going to say state dot email address and state dot password. Once we get the response from the server, we can again just yield state, which will have an updated auth failure or success option holding the response from the server. So we have just implemented the if branch if email and password are both valid. But what are we going to do if some of these fields has an invalid value? Well, then we of course do not want to send out an invalid value to the server to be registered with. Instead, we want to yield another state, so state.copy with, and what we want to yield here is show error messages set to true, because as I have shown you in the previous part, we are going to start showing error messages only after the sign in or register button is pressed. And lastly, again, we are just going to reset auth failure or success option to be none whenever the email address or password are invalid. This code certainly works, and we can go ahead and copy it over to sign in with email and password press and just change up the method which we are calling on the IAuth facade from register to sign in, right? But doing this is very irresponsible because you are just duplicating a bunch of code. I think this surely needs a lot of simplification. For example, we can eliminate this copy with call for when the email is valid and password is valid, where we are updating auth failure or success option to hold the server response. We can actually join it together with the very last state.copy with call. So to join it, we are going to set also is submitting to false. No matter if it was previously set to true, it doesn't really matter. Show error messages will still remain true, of course, but how are we going to get this failure or success either to outside the if block, because currently this is this variable is just local to this if statement. So the way we are going to get this failure or success outside of it here is of course by creating a non-final variable. So let's just create it above here. We're going to create either auth failure or unit. It's going to be called failure or success. And now we can set this from within the if block. And this means that failure or success will be null if the email is invalid. So basically we can do something like this, right? Once we get to the last copy with statement, we can just say failure or success option is null. Well, if it is null, we're going to set the response to be null, or none actually, but it's basically the same thing, just more safe. Otherwise, if it's not null, we are actually going to populate the auth failure or success option with some value which will hold the failure or success, which at this point is not null. But this is horrible. Like, this is a very long line of code to write. And that's why there is a handy helper constructor method from the darts package, which does just this, but we don't need to care about checking for null ourselves. That method is called option of. Just pass in the failure or success either, which can also have the possibility of being null. And now this will either return none or some, depending on the null status of our failure or success object. With this done, we can now just go ahead and quickly implement the sign in with email and password pressed event handler. So just copy this code and paste it down there. Change one call to sign in. And yeah, so we have just done something which is totally the wrong thing to do. We have just duplicated basically all the code except for one little change. How can we go about refactoring this mess? We can actually utilize the fact that in Dart, functions are also just classes, or actually they're first class citizens. It doesn't matter how you call it. We're going to utilize the fact that you can pass functions to other functions, also known as higher order functions. This means that we can break out the common code, so basically everything except for this single little call, into its own helper method, and that method will be passed in a function which has a signature where it returns future either auth failure unit and takes in email address and password as arguments. So let's just copy the contents of, for example, this SignIn Handler. We're going to go below and still within the Bloc class, just create a stream returning method. This stream will be sign-in form state. This is basically the same thing as the map event to state method, which itself returns a stream of sign-in form state. And inside here, we're actually going to give it a name, perform action on auth facade with email and password. I'm just going to copy it here. So perform action on auth facade with email and password. And now this thing will perform logic, which we have copied from the usual handler of the event. We will need to make this an asynchronous generator. And now, of course, we do not want to just straight out call sign in with email and password, because we need to be able to also call register with email and password. And as I said, we are going to utilize higher order functions to accomplish this. So we're going to actually create a function parameter, which will have a signature looking like, for example, the register method. So let's just copy the signature from the tooltip and we're going to paste it here. Bear with me for a while because this code is getting quite unruly, But anyway, the way we can actually have a function parameter within a function is to use the function class or function type. This parameter, which is of type function, which takes in email address and password and returns a future containing all of this, will be called as a regular parameter, forwarded call. So now we are talking. We can actually format this a bit more. And let's just also make these two parameters of a function, which is itself a parameter of a function. I know it's sort of an inception, but bear with me here. We're going to make this required as usual. Cool. So we have a function within another function, and now we can call this function instead of the concrete function, right? I hope you understand me. So what we're gonna do is that instead of calling auth facade register with email and password, we're instead going to just call forwarded call. And we don't care what this forwarded call is actually called itself or what it does. We just care that it fulfills the contract which we have set out. And that contract is that it needs to return a future containing either auth failure or unit. And it needs to be a function which takes in an email address and a password. As long as this contract is fulfilled, we are gonna be able to call this forwarded call. So what does this mean for our duplicate methods? Well, it means that, for example, from within register with email and password pressed, we can remove all of this code except for auth facade register with email and password. We're going to copy this or cut it out, then delete all of the code present inside the event handler. And by the way, if this is getting a bit too much for you at this point, you can always go through this lesson at your own pace from the written tutorial. And what we are now going to do here is that we are going to yield each. And each state which we are going to yield will come from calling perform action on auth facade with email and password. And now we're just going to pass in our function call here, which will call the auth facade register with email and password. Or actually, it will not call it directly here. We just want to pass around the function instance. So we're going to remove the parentheses and the arguments. So now what happens is that this perform action auth facade with email and password method will know which exact method to call on the auth facade, and it will pass in the email address and password which it gets from the state. So now let's do the same thing but with signing in. So let's delete everything from the SignIn event handler. We're going to also call the same helper method, but instead of register, we're gonna say sign in with email and password and not pass in any arguments in. And with that, we have just implemented email changed, password changed, register, sign in, and sign in with Google or email. And this means that the application layer for the sign-in form is fully done. And in the next part, we're going to implement the authentication facade, because currently it's just an abstract class which lacks any sort of an implementation. So if you want to go through this tutorial at your own pace once again, and also to get all of the code written in here, check out the written tutorial available from the link in the description. And if you are serious about becoming a great Flutter developer who can build real apps for clients or at a job, go to flutter.education, and the link is also in the video description, to get the top curated Flutter news and resources aimed at improving your app development career. Over there you can also subscribe to my mailing list to get the best Flutter resources delivered weekly right into your inbox. If you don't want to miss more tutorials like this, including the next part where we are going to implement the authentication facade, be sure to subscribe to this channel and also join Notification Squad by hitting the bell button to make sure you grow your Flutter skills, because here on ResoCoder I am determined to provide you with the best tutorials and resources so that you will become an in-demand Flutter developer. If this video helped you with understanding how to implement the block when we are dealing with a form in a DDD style app, be sure to give it a like and also share it with other developers who are surely gonna find it beneficial too. Leave a comment if you have anything to say, and see you in the next video.